Hey guys, I'm here today with a quick book summary of a book that I just finished and that I thought was interesting and uh, that some of you out there might be interested in. So this book is a book from 1985 by James C. Scott uh, called Weapons of the Weak. So James C. Scott, just as a little bit of an introduction, is a political scientist who has spent his life specializing in the politics of subordinate groups, specifically in Southeast Asia, but a lot of his theoretical um, work applies more broadly and can be used to understand political resistance of subordinate groups in pretty much any setting. Um, and he's looked at ways in which peasants resist oppression within the village, the ways in which people resist state uh, power. He's looked at hunter-gatherer groups and the ways in which they have sought to avoid domination by states. So his work is really wide-ranging. This is one of his first books that looks very specifically at a single farming village in Malaysia and looks at the techniques and strategies used by peasants there to eke out a reasonable form of life, even though they're facing a number of serious economic and political challenges there. So let's get started. So the setting of this book is very specific. It takes place in a single Malaysian rice village where Scott lived for over 2 years. And this is in 1980, which is an interesting time in Malaysian history because it's about 15 years into the Green Revolution in Malaysia, which is when artificial fertilizers and advanced artificially selected crops and eventually mechanized harvesters are introduced and begin to radically transform traditional rice agriculture in Malaysia. And what you get here is a clash of values. Specifically, you're seeing throughout this book kind of a clash between the traditional religious and agrarian values that have governed Malaysian peasant society for hundreds of years with the new sort of capitalist model of profit maximization that is coming into Malaysian villages along with advanced technologies. So international organizations and the Malaysian government are encouraging villagers not only to adopt new technologies, but also to adopt a new set of values focused around maximizing productivity for the market, rather than traditional Islamic values that often had a lot to do with the cohesion of the community and of wealthier villagers taking care of and providing alms to less wealthy villagers and stuff like that. So Scott's method was simply it was essentially ethnography. He lived in this village for 2 years and he worked alongside the villagers. He stayed in one of the houses of one of the villagers and basically did his best to talk to and get to know as many people in the village as possible. Now, of course, there are some limitations to this because he is just, a random white guy who's visiting the village for 2 years. So obviously there's going to be some stuff that he misses, but he does seem to get in on a number of private and very interesting conversations with pretty much everybody in the village. Also, on top of living with and listening to and talking to the people of the village, he also pays very careful attention to the actual economic data of the village, looking at the incomes of all of the different farmers and comparing then what the actual economic data says to what the farmers themselves say. Hang on, I'm going to move because the sun is right in my face. And this allows him to discover a number of very interesting results. One of the most interesting results is that everybody in the village claims to be poor. Even the wealthiest villagers claim to be poor, even though their income is often 10 times greater than the poorer villages within the village. Everybody claims poverty. And one of the things that he seeks to explain in his book is, why would rich peasants claim to be poor? Why would poor peasants claim to be poor? What are they actually accomplishing with these rhetorical moves here? We'll get back to that later. So Scott's theoretical lens here and what he's trying to do with this is he's trying to question traditional Marxist and capitalist readings of peasant behavior. Both Marxists and capitalists have often viewed peasants as largely conservative and politically neutral classes. Oftentimes, you'll see peasants characterized as politically inert and not doing anything, and then every once in a while freaking out and burning some stuff down before they get put down by the state, and then they go back to doing nothing again. That's the traditional view of peasant behavior, both among capitalist historians and Marxist theorists. Marx famously once called the French peasantry a bunch of potatoes in a sack, meaning that they were essentially politically useless when it came to revolution. Scott seeks to challenge this by showing that peasant political activity is going on all the time, and it's just not taking the form that Marxists or capitalist historians normally think of when they think of resistance. Along with this goal, he's also trying to rethink what resistance actually means. What are some different ways that subordinate groups can resist economic or political domination? And he tries to look for examples of this within the village where he's living. So some of the key ideas from the book that he explores are as follows. So first of all, Scott raises a key distinction between everyday resistance and revolutionary struggle. A lot of times in history and among theorists, there's a very strong preference for and almost a romanticization of revolutionary struggle, of people rising up and trying to overthrow an oppressive system and create a better system. However, these are very rare historically. And what Scott seeks to point out is that in between these periods of revolutionary upheaval, there's a sort of slow and often hidden resistance going on behind the scenes all the time. He calls it, at one point, the steady grinding effort to hold one's own against overwhelming odds, a spirit and a practice that prevents the worst and promises something better. An element of everyday resistance is that it is often covert. And he makes an important distinction between open and covert resistance. And the reason this is an important thing is if most subordinate groups lack political power. And what that means is that open resistance will often be met with violence. So strikes or rebellions or open class warfare can often result in devastating consequences for the people who engage in it. And so very frequently, subordinate groups decide that open rebellion is not the correct strategy. And instead, they opt for covert forms of resistance. And these are forms of resistance in which it's almost impossible for elites to figure out who's doing it. And very frequently, elites fail to even recognize covert resistance as resistance. It's very frequently disguised as not as open resistance, but merely as incompetence. And we'll look at that more. But so basically, one of the key takeaways here from Scott is that much resistance happens kind of below the waterline. It's an ever-present, diffuse, and not even necessarily centrally organized form of resistance, but it's just poor, oppressed people taking whatever steps they can to make their life better in the face of overwhelming domination by political or economic elites. So one other important idea that Scott spends a lot of time on is he points out that resistance is not simply material, but it is always also rhetorical or symbolic, and that subordinate people struggle not only to meet their basic material needs, but they also struggle to define their own situation and their own behavior in a way that gives them dignity and purpose. And that the elites often do the opposite. So for example, consider an act of theft. Elites will define theft as chaotic, as immoral, and as dishonest. Whereas at the same time, villagers in this village that Scott is living in defined theft in terms of traditional Islamic almsgiving. So poor villagers who engage in theft oftentimes refer to it using the Islamic word of zakat, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, in which wealthy people are supposed to give to less wealthy people, almsgiving, right? So the poor are actually redefining theft as a form of almsgiving. And what Scott points out is that it's oftentimes the stingiest and wealthiest landlords who are targeted and who are most often targeted for theft. And so not only is this a material struggle with the transfer of rice, which is the most common thing stolen, going from the wealthy to the poor, but it is also a rhetorical struggle on how we are going to understand these actions. Is theft dishonest and against the law and immoral, or is it simply a new form of charity, which the poor are basically taking into their own hands, since the wealthy are engaging in traditional forms of charity less and less frequently? So those are the main points. Struggle is rhetorical as well as material. It is often hidden, and it often goes on all the time right under the noses of the wealthy and the powerful. So what are some of the key takeaways here? So some important key takeaways that you can get from Scott are: 1, that subordinate groups do not accept their subordination. They do not accept the terms that the elites use for them. And they very often have their own hidden transcripts, as Scott tells them, ways in which they privately understand their own behavior that basically negate the elite view of the world. 2, there are lots of forms of resistance, and open revolutionary resistance is not the only kind, and is often not the best kind for the people who would actually be doing the rebelling. If there is a very small chance of a revolution succeeding and a very high probability of very, very negative consequences if the revolution fails, maybe everyday and covert resistance is a better option. Various forms of social activity that are denigrated by the elites actually take on a form of, actually come to be seen as resistance once you apply this lens. So stuff like gossip, theft, laziness, vandalism, begging, and unreliability at work can all be seen as functioning as ways in which peasants are resisting the encroachment of capitalist agriculture in Malaysia. And these same things could be viewed as forms of resistance among other subordinate groups. As a high school teacher, I often see this sort of stuff from many high school students. And I think it's important to realize that this might not just be high schoolers being lazy and bad students, but is actually a way in which they can resist the massive workloads and stressful schedules that teachers impose upon them. It's a collective form of resistance against domination by the school. Political struggle is everywhere, but often hidden. So it's important to keep that in mind, that these struggles are going on all the time, and even if elites aren't aware of them, they are happening. And last of all, and I think that this is really important, is that observers and theoreticians need to make sure that they are listening to and trying to understand resistance in the terms of the people who are actually doing the resistance. And you got to be careful not to apply your own kind of theoretical models that don't necessarily fit. And so what we see with Scott is that it's only after spending years in this village that he's able to uncover these sort of hidden transcripts and these covert forms of rhetorical or material resistance, and that they're not obvious at all from the outside. So it's very important when seeking to understand political struggle is to try and engage in the deepest possible reading instead of applying sort of preset ideological filters to understanding what's going on. So anyway, that's Weapons of the Weak. I thought it was a pretty good book, and if you want to learn more about that stuff, I recommend that you read it. Also, all Scott's other books are also really good.